Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you very much for joining me today. I've got a very special episode. I call this one A Century of Humanoids. Humanoids have been seen for a very long time, and that's what I really want to focus on today. Our cases reaching all the way back to the 1920s, right up through the 2020s. So that's actually 110 years inclusive. Yeah, a lot of humanoids seen all over the world. I've got cases from Europe, cases from the United States, from Canada, from South America, just all over the planet and reaching back a long, long time. These, of course, involve a wide variety of humanoids, a wide variety of interactions with ETs, lots of physical evidence, some really interesting multiple witness cases. There are some cases that are quite brief but still really interesting, and others that are a bit more complicated and complex. But all of them, I think, and I've said this many times, have something to contribute to our understanding of extraterrestrial visitations. It's always amazing to me that there are still skeptics out there because there are just so many darn cases. And the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call 20 Aliens. This one occurred way, way back in the summer of 1922 in Detroit, Michigan. This wasn't a fully investigated case, though it was at least partially investigated by a professional investigator. And it's so interesting because it does have multiple witnesses. It's a very close-up sighting of a craft with humanoids inside of it. And yeah, it took place so long ago. And that alone makes this case, I think, very significant. This case comes from researcher Dr. Ron Westrom, who received a letter from the primary witness. Her name is Irma Hines, and according to Irma, she and her then boyfriend, William O'Brien, were walking home from a movie in Detroit, Michigan. It was around 10 p.m. as they were walking along Dragoon Street. This is located between West Fort Street and West Jefferson Avenue. There was a large vacant lot alongside this avenue. The street there is now demolished. But as they were walking along Dragoon Street, suddenly the sky lit up with light, and they watched this large disc-shaped object descend to treetop level. At this point, it began to circle around a large tree. The whole craft was rotating as it did this. They said this craft had rectangular windows lining the bottom perimeter of the disc. And it was through these windows, these portholes, that they observed about 20 humanoid figures. According to Irma, these figures appeared to be seated, and they could only see the shoulders and heads. But the figures were all bald-headed and had close-set eyes. And they were staring down intently at the young couple. Now both Irma and William watched this for several minutes, but became frightened as they realized how unusual this was, and they quickly hurried away. Irma immediately told her parents when she arrived home, but her mother wondered if Irma had perhaps experienced some kind of strange vision. And it wasn't until years later that she wrote to Dr. Ron Westrom and shared her encounter. Now, Irma's daughter, Carol Hines, confirmed her mother's account, and it turns out that Irma's then boyfriend, William O'Brien, has not come forward with his account, and they were unable to locate him. A really amazing case. I can't imagine what it would be like to see 20 ETs staring down at you from the portholes of a craft that's hovering that low. You can see that it did make a very lasting impression on the witness, and I'm certainly glad she reported it to Ron Westrom, who is a very well-respected researcher. And here's the next case I'd like to cover. We're going up through the decades. This was in the 1930s, and I call this case a UFO lands for repairs. This is an interesting case because it occurred way back in the summer of 1933 in Nipawin, Saskatchewan, Canada. And this is a multiple witness case with at least 4 witnesses and some corroborating surrounding witnesses. I also like this case because it involves a landed craft. There are landing traces to support this. It was viewed for a pretty long time, and it's just an all-around fascinating case involving humanoids. This very early report of a landing and humanoids comes from researcher John Brent Musgrave, and it was again in the summer of 1933, quite some time ago, that numerous reports began circulating among the local homesteaders in the small town of Nipawin. They were seeing strange lights. I mean, not only in the sky, but near the ground, and many of them were near the Tobin Lake area. Some thought the lights might be explained as swamp gas because there were lots of bogs and swamps in that area, but other witnesses were not convinced. They thought it might be very strange objects of some kind. So, one summer evening around midnight, 2 men and a woman decided to drive to the area where these lights were being seen. And as they did so, they saw a strange light ahead of them. Unfortunately, the road was too rough, so they exited their vehicle and began hiking through the woods towards this light. And they hiked right up to the edge of a very large bog and could not get any closer. But they were now close enough to see the source of this glowing light about a quarter mile away. They actually had a perfect unobstructed view of what they described as a large saucer-shaped craft which was resting on landing legs. They could see that it had a dome-shaped top, a door in the center from which a ladder-like staircase extended down to the ground. The craft itself glowed bright, quote, unearthly orange, and it was lighting up the area all around it. Surrounding this craft were about a dozen silver-suited figures wearing helmets or caps of some kind, and they looked slightly smaller than your average person, about 5 feet tall, and they appeared to be scurrying around busily, although in perfect silence. All the witnesses did have the impression that they were repairing this craft. Now, the occupants did not appear to notice that they were being observed by the witnesses, and these witnesses actually watched this craft and the occupants for a long time, about a half hour. At one point they thought about shouting out and trying to get their attention, but instead they decided to get back to the truck and see if they could find another route around the bog and get a closer look. Unfortunately, they got low on gas and had to return. But it was a few nights later, during a full moon, that they returned to the site, and there was nothing there, but they waited until dawn and hiked up to this area, were able to get right to it, and they were hoping to find evidence that there had been a craft there, and they found it all right. They found 6 large square imprints, which they believe were the landing legs of this craft. They said each imprint was about 2 feet square, 2 to 3 inches deep, and they were spaced about 8 to 10 feet apart. And they also saw a depression in the vegetation in the ground where the stair or ramp had apparently come down. Now, in the center of all of this was a burned circle about 12 feet in diameter. They didn't see any actual footprints, but it did look as though the ground in this area had been disturbed. They brought a camera with them, they took photographs of this imprint, and afterwards they sent copies of these photographs along with their story to several newspapers and magazines. But to their disappointment, none of the magazines were interested in the story. So they kind of dropped it, and in fact it wasn't until 40 years later that they spoke with researcher John Brent Musgrave and shared their story. Unfortunately, by then, they were unable to locate the photographs. A truly interesting case, and what a shame that newspapers and journals at the time had no interest in the story. It's even more of a shame these photographs of the landing traces and alleged footprints are no longer available or were not able to be located, because that would bring this case to a whole new level. But given that it does involve 4 witnesses and so many people in the area were seeing UFOs, I think it's a legit case. And it's certainly interesting because while it is speculation that this UFO landed for repairs, this is something that does turn up in a number of cases. And in fact, in a few of the upcoming cases in this little collection, we hear this. So maybe that's what was going on. Don't know for sure, but absolutely interesting. And now we move to a really fascinating case, probably one of the most complex and perhaps interesting in this little collection. I call this next case an uninvited guest. And by that, it's the actual human who had this experience that was apparently uninvited, or at least that was his perception. On the other hand, he also feels like this was something that was meant for him to experience. This incident occurred on May 18 in 1946. This was well before UFOs were at all popular. And I'm probably going to butcher the place name, but I'll do my best. It's called Skuldervikstranden, Sweden. And this may be one of Sweden's most famous contact cases. It's certainly pretty well known in the country. I've heard of it here and there, but I finally decided it was time to take a deeper look at it, because this is a case that did involve landing traces, electromagnetic effects, and affected the witness profoundly. It absolutely, completely changed the course of his life, as we shall see. The main witness in this case is Gosta Karlsson, who at the time of his encounter was a 28-year-old beekeeper and train dispatcher. And again, this is arguably one of Sweden's most famous humanoid cases and UFO landings. It was on the evening of May 18, 1946, as Gosta was walking through a forest of birch and pine trees when he noticed something strange up ahead on the path. As he says in his own words, "At the far end of the meadow, just a few meters from a lonely pine, stands an illuminated craft that I have never seen the like of, either before or since. My first thought is that it's a funfair carousel, that someone drove there somehow. But I soon realized that it would be impossible because no roads lead to the clearing." So as he looks at this object, he can see that it's disc-shaped and silver in color. It was resting on the ground. He saw a hatch or a doorway was opened, and a small ladder was extended down to the ground. This object had a small dome on top with little oval portholes all around it. He also noticed a large antenna-type device which was sticking out from the top, and it was emitting this sort of dome of light around the entire craft and the area surrounding it. Now, surrounding the craft and also standing on top of its surface were several human-like figures. And as Gosta says, "While looking at the craft, I can't help but think that someone is trying to joke with me. One thought that goes through my head is that it may be German pilots who have escaped from some prison camp. But deep down, I don't really believe it." So remember, this is just after World War II, so this was his mindset at the time. Gosta could smell an ozone-like odor in the air, and looking at this craft, he saw that this was very advanced. There were no seams or rivets of any kind, just one smooth piece of metal. He saw that these figures surrounding the craft were all wearing tight-fitting white sort of astronaut suits with blue-black boots and belts. But he did notice that these suits had no zippers, buttons, or any markings of any kind. They did go over the head, and there were transparent faceplates. So very much intrigued, Gosta walked right up to the craft. And as he says, "The strange thing was that everyone turned to me when I entered the clearing. It was as if I was expected but not welcome." So, as he approached, he saw that these figures included both men and women, and most paid little attention to him and appeared to be very busy working or repairing the craft, was his impression. Again, he says they were human looking, but he noticed that they seemed to be communicating without talking out loud. And as he stepped even closer, the figure who was closest to him suddenly raised his hand in a gesture which Gosta clearly understood to mean stop, do not advance further. And he watched as they continued to work on this craft. At one point, he did see a female figure exit the craft and start handing out cups of liquid for everyone to drink. He tried to step forward again, but the guard again cautioned him to stand back. And as Gosta says, when I take a step back, everyone continues with their job, and I feel mildly chagrined and frustrated. Two of the girls smile so beautifully at me, and I see their sparkling white teeth. I can boast that I am not usually afraid of anything, and I have spent enough time in the woods and on the ground not to believe in the devil nor trolls. But this is weird, very strange. So he can see that these figures are smiling and clearly happy and at peace. This really struck him, that they seem to be a very tranquil people. And then he saw one of the figures take this weird flashing object and throw it on the ground, as if discarding it. And in shock, Gosta decided at this point to back away from the saucer and the figures and return to the trail to circle around and see if he can approach from the other side. But shortly after he does so, he sees this craft rise up into the air. As he says in his own words, slowly and majestically, the heavy craft rises, which I can now see clearly. It's almost like a balloon rising, only there is a whistling sound as heard from a vacuum cleaner motor. So as he watched, this craft rose to about 1,500 feet. It then turned sideways, glowed bright red, and then shot away at incredible speed. Gosta remained where he stood because, as he says, he was, quote, quite overwhelmed and shaken. This encounter really had a profound effect on him. Again, having just experienced World War II, not long before all this, he again wondered if this craft could be a secret military craft. But in the next few years, it turned out that the country of Sweden experienced this huge wave of ghost rockets. This was ushering in the modern age of UFOs, and he began to realize that his experience was most likely involving extraterrestrials. But after this encounter, he left the site and went home, but he returned the very next day hoping to find evidence, and he did. He says he immediately found a ring of burned vegetation as well as depressions on the ground where this craft had rested. He said the ring was about 52 feet in diameter, and the landing pod marks were about 2 feet 9 inches. And he also found boot prints on the ground. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting and somewhat controversial, because he said he found something else, an actual ET artifact. As he says in his own words, just as I was finished and about to go home, I remembered the shiny object that the girl threw out. I recalled the location, a small mound near the curtain of light. When I looked there, I saw something glistening in the grass, and I picked up a shiny rod of violet quartz, about 10 centimeters thick, 13 centimeters wide, that's 4 inches by 5 inches, and about 30 centimeters long, about a foot. He says it had beveled corners and was burnt and melted at one end. About 30 centimeters or so away, I found a small, beautiful ring with a ring size of 17 and some green metal and a beautiful stone in a frame. And that's not all. He says he also found 2 of the cups left by the ETs, some with some liquid still in it. So he collected these artifacts, he says, and kept them to himself, not revealing them to anyone. It was 2 days after this encounter, he says, that he began having vivid, realistic dreams, which he quickly realized were more than dreams. He believed this was actual contact, because in these dreams, he saw one of the ETs sitting in the pilot's seat of the craft. He saw this very clearly, and in this dream, this ET spoke to him and said, quote, "I thought I would get in touch with you and explain what we were doing when you saw us over there in the woods." And the ET proceeded to explain to Gosta that they had had an accident and had to repair their craft. So this was the first of many of these dreamlike visitations, where Gosta saw visions of the ET's planet, strange ET cities, and in fact he began to hold long conversations with them about all kinds of subjects, about karma, life after death, reincarnation, the origin of the universe, and much more. The ETs told him that they had long ago moved beyond war and disease, and that they lived many hundreds of years. So, as a result of all this, years later in 1953, Gosta founded a company called Cernel, which actually uses pure pollen extract to develop an herbal pharmaceutical for medicinal use. According to Gosta, this substance can slow down aging, and he says he based it on the alien healing drink he found in the alien cups. So you can take that for what it's worth. In 2003, Gosta did pass away from a stroke. His artifacts and notes and all his documentation of this incident have never been found, though, according to researcher Klaus Swan, he says that Gosta did in fact show these artifacts to him. So in some ways it is a controversial case, but the fact is Gosta's company, Cernel, was very successful. That is undeniable. It made him very wealthy. And to this day, there is a UFO monument memorializing Gosta's encounter. So what an interesting case that is. I mean, there aren't many cases that have a monument memorializing a UFO incident. And it's also interesting because it is a very early case, which predated the modern age of UFOs, kind of ushered in that era, because it was just after Gosta's encounter that Sweden was hit by a major wave of what we call ghost rockets. And that was the first time that modern society really began to notice that we were being visited. And it's a super fascinating case in a lot of ways, with landing traces, apparent artifacts, electromagnetic effects, the full-length book he wrote about his case. And given the fact that Gosta's company was so successful, I think that lends another level of credibility to his account. It's super interesting. And now we move on to the next case, which is also equally fascinating. And I call this one the Laughing Alien. This is a really interesting case which involves a landing and humanoids exiting the craft, humanoids that were quite short but looked very much like us and were displaying emotions that we hear from normal people. So that alone makes this a super interesting case. It occurred on August 14, 1951 in Vargenza, Italy. This next case comes from Italian researcher Maurizio Verga, and it involves a farmer who wishes to remain anonymous. This farmer lived outside the very small town of Vargenza, located in northern Italy. And it was around 1 p.m. on August 14, 1951, when this farmer saw a saucer-shaped object land in the open fields next to the town's cemetery, which you can see here. And the farmer approached to about 150 feet of this object in order to get a closer look at it. And when he did, he could now see that this object, he estimates, was about 20 feet in diameter, was composed of a whitish aluminum, sort of metallic looking metal. And he saw a series of bluish portholes lining the circumference, and there was a dome on top. So this is sort of your typical flying saucer. He says the craft itself sat on landing legs, and he saw two stair-like structures extended from either side down to the ground. And he was staring in amazement at this strange craft, when he saw that there were actually 6 strange men standing nearby, seeming to examine the cemetery with great curiosity. They saw him and began to approach. He says they were pretty much human-looking, but each of them was very short, only about 4 feet tall. They were all dressed in shiny white one-piece overalls with knee-high boots. On their heads they wore round, transparent, sort of fishbowl helmets. There were 3 antennae, 2 on either side and 1 on top. He says on the back of their suits were cylinders connected to tubes, which led to the helmets. So he had the impression these were breathing devices. Their suits had helmets with what looked like multicolored lenses attached to them. And each of these figures carried what the witness assumed was some kind of weapon in one of their hands. Now he got a good look at them. These figures themselves had white skin and faces that were not quite human, almost looked monkey-like to him, but their eyes were round and, he said, azure blue. He said their arms were disproportionately long, reaching down past their knees. 5 of the figures, he said, were clean-shaven, but 1 did have a reddish beard. And as they approached the witness, he actually could hear them laughing. Now the bearded figure who was closest to the farmer gestured towards him with what the farmer assumed was a greeting, and he could see the others communicating with hand gestures, but they weren't making any other sounds other than this laughter. Now, suddenly one of the figures raised this object in his hand and pointed it at the witness, and the farmer suddenly realized he was being struck by a dazzling white light. He says it didn't paralyze him or really have any other effect other than to dazzle him briefly, but it was at this point that the figures retreated to their craft. According to the farmer, 3 entered the craft on the steps at one side, and the other 3 used the steps on the opposite side. And he noticed that the figure with the beard was the last to enter the craft. Now once inside, the steps quickly retracted, as did the landing legs. At the same time, this craft emitted a loud whooshing noise, which the farmer said reminded him of a vacuum cleaner. He saw a small nozzle-type device appear on the center underside of the craft, which emitted a reddish-green flame. At this point, the object rose slowly, stopped momentarily, then tilted onto its side and streaked away at high speed, disappearing off into the distance. Below, where this craft had hovered, the farmer now saw a 25-foot wide area of burned soil. I love that case because it occurred in broad daylight. He saw these ETs in this craft from very close up. I find it fascinating that this craft landed right next to a cemetery, because I did do a prior episode of UFOs hovering over cemeteries, landing next to them, humanoids walking among them. They seem to be drawn to cemeteries for some reason. That is a whole other episode. So if you want to take a look at the connection to cemeteries and graveyards, you can definitely look that up. But this would be another case to add to that category. And that's another reason that I think it's a super interesting case. And of course the landing traces and all that as well. But there's always another case. That's what's so amazing about this field, is how many cases there are. And the next case I'd like to talk about today, you probably haven't heard of. It's not very well known at all. I'd never heard of it, but once I heard about it, I thought, wow, this is super interesting. It's got some very interesting aspects to it. So I decided to include it in this little chronology, and I call this one The Glowing Green Men. And this one occurred in 1965 in Cumbria, England. The main witnesses in this case are a young couple with an infant son who were driving along very late at night and had one of the most interesting experiences of their lives. This next very unusual case comes from UFO researcher and accomplished artist David Sankey. The witnesses are a young couple who insisted upon anonymity. They're known only by Mr. and Mrs. C. and they were with their infant baby at the time of the encounter. And as researcher David Sankey writes, neither of the couple have spoken of this to anybody before. I only found out because I am a friend of the family. I have to say, this couple are totally straightforward and were in no way under the influence of drink or drunks when this happened, nor do they have any mental problems. So this encounter began on a winter night around 3 a.m., again in 1965, as the couple drove along the A6 highway between the towns of Beetham and Milnthorpe in South Cumbria. It was a very stormy night, so they decided to pull off the road and wait for better weather. And shortly after pulling over, this is when they noticed a bright red light coming from behind a stone wall alongside the road. And looking at the source of this light, they could very clearly see a glowing red dome-shaped object sitting on the ground about 75 feet away from them behind this wall. The bottom part was obscured by the wall itself, but they could see the top half of it. And right as soon as they noticed this, they immediately saw three short figures who were now standing in front of the wall and actually approaching their vehicle. It was strange because two of them, as they watched, put their arms outstretched in front of them, while one of these figures kept its arms at its side. They said that all three of these figures had very large, sort of turnip-shaped heads, large round staring eyes, a long trunk-like nose, but just a slit for a mouth. The witnesses couldn't tell if these figures were wearing clothes or not, but they did notice that these figures' bodies seemed to glow with a slight green luminescence. And they were quite close. I mean, these figures were only about 15 feet from their car. Now, they immediately became consumed with fear and drove off. And they said nothing. They did not talk about it until they reached the next town of Milnthorpe, which was just a short distance away. Now later, here's where it gets even stranger. When being interviewed by David Sankey, both witnesses said that although they drove off in fear, they both felt that the figures were friendly, and they were a little bit embarrassed about their fear of this incident, because this is so strange. Both these witnesses said that they recalled actually touching the figures, or didn't so much recall touching them, but remembered what they felt like. Mrs. C said the touch of the figures was nice, pleasant, while Mr. C recalled that they kind of felt like rubber. But it was weird because neither could recall actually touching the figures physically. Now their infant son did not react, though there are a few strange endnotes to this case, because it was 13 years later, when the son was about 14 years old, he was outside playing with friends, when he and his friends all observed a small spherical object drop from the sky, glide towards them, then float away. But shortly later it returned again, as if observing the children, and then shot off into the distance at high speed and was gone. So clearly not a balloon or anything conventional. The children did feel like this object had an interest in them. It turned out this teen did develop severe cancer, and tests showed the presence of radium in his body. They can't be sure if this has any connection to his encounters, but thankfully the child did make a complete recovery. But again, they still all insisted on complete anonymity, as they feared what other people might think about them if they went public with their encounter. So here we go again, a case that very nearly didn't see the light of day, that we would never have heard about if not for a series of fortuitous circumstances. The witnesses very nearly did not talk about it, and they're still anonymous and probably haven't told anyone but those that they fully trust. So we're lucky to hear about this case and the vast majority of cases we hear about, because I've said it a million times, most people don't report their cases, but that's especially true if it involves humanoids, missing time, or an onboard encounter, or any sort of extensive encounter. The bigger, the more extensive the encounter, the less likely, I think, a person is to report it. So that speaks volumes when you consider how many people have reported their encounters and how many cases there are. Like this next one, which I wanted to include because it illustrates a very strange aspect of UFO encounters. And I call this one a Bigfoot UFO encounter. I did a whole episode on Bigfoot UFO encounters, but here's another one that I did not include in that prior episode because I didn't know about it. But it's a very well verified case with multiple witnesses, a lot of surrounding encounters to support this initial one. This one occurred on February 22nd, 1976 in Great Falls, Montana. And boy, this case is a doozy. This next very interesting case occurred around 10 a.m. again on February 22nd, 1976, as 29-year-old Leonard Hegel was driving with his wife and their 2 children along Interstate 15 just outside of Great Falls, Montana. And this is when they all saw what appeared to be a Bigfoot walking right along the highway through a field about a quarter mile from the road itself. They could see that this figure was huge, about 7 feet tall, they estimate, with a 3-foot wide shoulder span. And per Leonard, it was walking in this weird, non-human manner. He immediately pulled his car over, exited the vehicle, grabbed his gun, and pursued the creature on foot. And he ran towards it, approaching to about 700 or 800 feet, when this creature turned around to face him. And then he felt a little bit different about chasing him, because as Leonard says in his own words, "I was carrying a .357 Magnum pistol, but when he turned around, I felt completely defenseless." According to Leonard, this creature was, quote, "solid and muscular." Now, I didn't get close enough to see if it was covered with hair or not, but he did say that this creature was very large, walked with a huge stride length, and its arms were swinging by its side. And as he says, quote, "it was no human." So now, clearly frightened, Leonard decided to end his chase and retreat back to the car. But before he did, he noticed something very strange. A large gray oval-shaped object was hovering in the air just a short distance beyond the Bigfoot. And it was very low. He estimates it was hovering only 10 feet above the ground, but it would periodically ascend and descend in kind of a yo-yo fashion about 15 feet in either direction. And he was close enough that he could also hear a high-pitched sound. So they left the area and end up reporting their sighting to Sheriff Captain Keith Wolverton, who you can see here. Keith, as it turns out, had been receiving reports of Bigfoot on and off for a while in this area, including one day before Leonard Hegel's sighting. He received another a few months after Hegel's sighting. This was on April 4th. Then, in mid-July, he got a report from a woman driving along Interstate 15 from the city of Ulm to Great Falls. It was around 5:30 a.m. She was 5 miles west of Great Falls when she saw this very large creature, which she estimates was 7 to 8 feet tall with, quote, "very wide shoulders," and it was standing right alongside the road. In fact, she stopped her car and watched it for a good 4 minutes when it suddenly bounded off into the wilderness. It was just a few days later, another report occurred on the evening of July 21st when 4 men saw 2 Bigfoot just east of the Rainbow Dam on the south side of the Missouri River. And per Captain Keith Wolverton, it was the 6th report of this Bigfoot-type creature in 1975 alone. But it was only Leonard Hegel's sighting that involved a Bigfoot. However, Captain Keith Wolverton reports his own sighting, which occurred on the evening of November 11, that same year. He and his deputy were driving from Missoula to Great Falls when a very large orange light descended and traveled at incredible speed. In fact, it passed directly over his cruiser at a height of only 200 feet. And as Officer Wolverton says, it went from horizon to horizon in 4 seconds. It was impossible to determine its size or shape in the brief time we saw it. Now, he did report it to officials at Malmstrom Air Force Base and learned from his co-employee, Sheriff Pete Howard, pictured here. Pete Howard actually interviewed the witnesses. That turned out earlier that day, a B-52 bomber was flying over Freezeout Lake when a strange object began pacing the aircraft. And get this, suddenly this object approached the plane, briefly attached itself to the plane itself, then detached itself and climbed out of sight. It was very strange because when this object physically touched the plane's radar equipment completely failed. And remember, Malmstrom Air Force Base has a long history of very dramatic sightings. Well, how interesting is that there are so many encounters with Bigfoot and UFO going on in the same area. In most of these cases, these two phenomena didn't intersect. In that one case, they did, which makes it clear there is a connection there. It's very hard to say what it is. Some people think that Bigfoot might be an ET. I considered that possibility, but now having examined a lot of cases like this, I honestly think that Bigfoot and Sasquatch are sentient, intelligent beings and psychic as well, and probably are in contact with ETs much in the same way that humans are. So I know how this must sound to a skeptic, but yeah, I think the connection is that some Bigfoot are UFO contactees. I don't know. That's pure speculation, but that does appear to be what's going on. Hopefully, more research and more cases on this particular aspect of UFO encounters will bring more answers. Now, moving along through the years, here is another case which is super interesting, quite unusual. It does involve multiple witnesses and landing traces, and I call this one the Robot and the Monk. It's not a super well-known case, but it is pretty well verified in terms of being researched. It occurred on July 11, 1978, outside of the small town of Ibiza, Spain. This case was originally reported solely in a Spanish newspaper, but was then published by researcher Iker Jimenez in his Spanish book, UFO Encounters. It was around 1 p.m. as two children, known only by their initials AB and FC, they were age 10 and 11 respectively. These two kids were playing in a farm field near the town of Ibiza, Spain. This is located on an island off the coast of Spain. And they were climbing in a carob tree when they heard this strange noise. Now they first thought it might be an animal of some kind, so they climbed down to investigate. And this is when they saw a very strange looking, sort of 6-foot tall robotic figure. They said it was shiny silver in color, humanoid in shape, with a flattened head. The front part of its face showed only 2 vertical slits where the eyes would be. They also saw the back side of it, and the back of the head showed this weird sort of small hollow circle from which emerged 2 rods or sort of antenna-like objects. Now suddenly this robotic figure, which not only looked strange, it began moving very strangely, moving towards the children in long loping jumps. This caused them to completely panic. The 2 kids immediately fled, running towards a fence. Upon reaching the fence, they quickly turned around to see if this figure was still following them, and they now saw a second figure which was standing near the first one. And this second figure looked different. It appeared to be humanoid, but it was wearing what looked like a long white robe which had 2 vertical black stripes on the front of the torso. They said that this figure had long black hair and what looked like a beard, and in the center of the chest was what looked like a star-like symbol. This figure was about 6 feet tall, they estimate, but they could see its robe sort of waving in the wind. And this was when they noticed something else, a very large object parked in a field a short distance away. And as they watched this object rose upwards, it emitted a blue orb which began to move towards them. So when this happened, the two children ran, and they said that they were actually chased quite a long distance down the street by this blue light. It chased them most of the way home, they said. But upon arriving home, this blue light was gone. The two kids immediately told their fathers what they had seen. So their fathers, the kids, a whole group of people returned to the site of the encounter. And when they arrived, unfortunately, the UFO and the strange figures were gone. But after searching the ground, they allegedly found a 50-foot wide triangular area of crushed grass with 3 circles inside it. It's just one case after another. There are so many interesting cases. And that one is super fascinating. While the witnesses were very young, I think the fact that there's 2 of them and that they were so emotional about what happened to them, and that there were landing traces found, I think it's a legit case, but definitely involving very unusual ETs. And now we move to the next case, and this one I call He Was Not Human. This one occurred on February 13, 1980 in the town of Estancia Rafaela, and this is in Santa Fe, Argentina. This is a super fascinating case because I think it speaks as to why some ETs land and wander around, because it looks to me in this case the ET was studying the effects of the environment, which is very interesting because that's exactly what the witness himself was doing. This very interesting case was reported on by Albert Rosales in his book Humanoid Encounters, but was originally investigated by the Argentinian UFO study group OSIFE. The witness in this case has requested complete anonymity. He is known only by his initials CRS. This case took place on February 13, 1980 in the small village of Estancia, again in Argentina. Mr. CRS had recently acquired the property rights to a field which he planned to use to farm and raise livestock. However, there was an issue. This property bordered the Prussian River, and a large amount of industrial waste from an upstream tannery and explosives factory was known to pollute this river. So Mr. CRS brought the landowner, the owner of the property, and a veterinarian to check on the property to make sure it was okay to farm. And to get to the property, which was quite isolated, they had to walk through a thick forest area. There was also a border of thick thorn bushes, which was almost impenetrable. So after all 3 of them got there, the landowner went to check on the fences to make sure that they were good, while the veterinarian went to examine the river. The main witness, Mr. CRS, was kind of tired, so he decided he would just wait at the property. And it was around 15 minutes in the afternoon, right afternoon actually, as the witness, Mr. CRS, sat down and was drinking some water when he noticed a strange figure approaching from the stream. This figure was about 75 feet away, right next to the stream. And this figure, he noticed immediately, looked very strange. So Mr. CRS got up, walked a few steps closer to approach the figure, and this is when he realized that this figure was not human. He said it was dressed in a metallic white suit, kind of reminding him of a fencer. But this suit had 3 metallic rings at all the joints, the neck, the elbows, the waist, and the knees. The suit went up over the head of the figure without covering the face. The main witness could not quite see the face. He couldn't make it out. He did notice that the figure wore a large backpack, which reminded him of an astronaut suit. Now at this point, he had only a side view of this figure, but he could see that this figure was holding a hose-like device, similar in appearance to sort of a golf club. It was in its right hand, and this figure was bending down to stick the lower end of this device into the stream, apparently to collect water. That was certainly the impression CRS got. But after doing so, this hose-like device retracted and was gone from view, and it was at this point that the being turned to its right, facing CRS in a, quote, mechanical movement. And he began to walk towards CRS in smooth, springing steps. And in fact, it looked to the witness as if this figure was actually floating. And as he watched, he saw that the grass was flattening out in front of the figure as if there was some sort of force field surrounding it. This strange figure approached the witness to a distance of about 30 feet, and it was at this point that the witness found himself unable to move. But at the same time, he says he was overwhelmed by this powerful feeling of, quote, perfect peace and harmony. He also noticed that there was an unnatural silence pervading, enveloping the whole area. Now Mr. CRS was amazed because this figure did not appear to take any notice of him whatsoever. And even as this figure got close, he still couldn't see any face. And he was even more astonished when this figure walked right up to the thorn bushes bordering the field and walked right through them. In fact, it seemed as though the thorn bushes sort of opened up to allow the figure to move forward. Again, this strange sort of force field. The strange figure disappeared off into the bushes and was gone. So a short time later, the other two men, the property owner and the veterinarian, returned, and without saying anything about his experience, Mr. CRS asked both of them if they had seen anything strange. The landowner said that yes, didn't see anything, but he did notice an odd, eerie silence surrounding the area. The veterinarian, however, did see something. He agreed about the strange, eerie silence, but says that he also noticed animals of all kinds were running in a complete panic to the south, away from the field where this figure had been. So this is a good animal reaction case. And it turned out there's an interesting sort of prequel to all of this, because it was only a few months earlier, in October of 1979, that this farmer, Mr. CRS, and the same two men were in this field. This was prior to him actually acquiring use of the property, and they had all gone to inspect it. And this is when all three of them saw this silver sphere floating in the daylight sky. So apparently this was connected to the following encounter. Hard to say for sure, but certainly very interesting. A really interesting case and a lot to learn from it. I think this is a case, like I said earlier, that does speak to the ET's concern about the environment. Another thing I found fascinating about this case is something I've heard before when other people make contact with ETs, is they feel this overwhelming sense of peace and tranquility. There's something about being very close to these guys that appears to bring on these really amazing feelings. It's also interesting that the ET really didn't pay much attention to the witness, that the ET seemed to have a job to do and was gonna do it, and off he went on his merry way. But yeah, a super interesting case for a lot of reasons. And now we move to the next case. This one is also really interesting. It's quite brief, but I think definitely worthy of attention. This one I call the Childlike ETs, and it occurred on December 12, 1997, and this was in Croatia, in a little area called, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Sirlevsko, Šibenik, Croatia. And it's just a super fascinating case of a UFO landing, little ETs getting out, and a gentleman having a very close encounter and interaction with them. Big thanks again to Albert Rosales, author of Humanoid Encounters, for bringing this next case to light of a very interesting landing and humanoid. This occurred on a small farm, again on December 12, 1997. This is located in Sarajevo, located outside of Šibenik, Croatia. The sole witness is a farmer by the name of Janko Vrancik, who was described by his friends and neighbors as honest and down to earth. And it was around noon as Janko was herding his cattle and he saw this metallic sort of iron-shaped object approaching from the southeast. As it came close, Janko could hear that this object made a quiet humming noise, and then as he watched, it proceeded to land in a nearby field, very close to him. And as he watched, 4 slender, childlike figures emerged from the object. Janko had heard about UFOs and ETs by watching them on television, so he had no fear of them. And he quickly approached and actually offered to share his lunch, which was composed of figs and ham. He says the ETs replied in sort of broken Croatian that they were not hungry. And it was after about 4 minutes these little figures quickly returned back into the craft. The humming noise began again, and the craft took off towards the northwest and was gone. Yeah, a very brief case and not super well researched. I mean, I don't have any other information on it, but so fascinating of this farmer just walking right up to this landed UFO and offering his lunch. I don't know how other people would react that way, but he felt no fear. It was a very benevolent encounter and so interesting. And now we move on to the next encounter, which I call the UFO in the black cloud. This is a really interesting case. I think it shows some really interesting aspects to UFOs and how they can remain hidden. It's one of the reasons I wanted to include it. This one occurred on September 28, 2008 in Perdido Key, Florida. The main witness in this case is a gentleman known only as Jim, a 57-year-old retired Marine, and he reported his experience to MUFON. It's case number 57018, and Jim and his fiancée Linda had just married and they were on their honeymoon at Perdido Key. This is just a 16-mile long barrier island west of Pensacola in Florida. As you can see pictured here, they were staying in some condominiums. And it was a beautiful day. The sky was blue with a few white puffy clouds as Jim and Linda were taking a walk alongside this beach. And looking up, Jim noticed this strange black cloud that seemed out of place. It was a strange dark color he had never really seen before. It was quite small. And as he watched, it was actually moving in their direction. And it became clear to him that this wasn't a cloud, or certainly not a normal cloud, because it accelerated and then stopped. And this was just about 150 feet above and in front of them both. And as he looked up at it, it suddenly flashed a bright light that lit up the cloud for 10 seconds. And this is when he noticed something really amazing. He could see a dull gray spherical craft lined with illuminated portholes. And to his shock, he could see the silhouette of a strange being looking down at him from one of the portholes. He said that this object, or that this figure was, quote, not huge, about the size of a 14 or 15-year-old, kind of skinny and dark, but not black. He couldn't see any details of its face, just the silhouette. But as he says, I have to be honest, I was really scared. So after about 10 seconds, this cloud turned completely black again, and thoroughly frightened by the sight of this thing, Jim turned to his wife Linda and said, let's get out of here. He didn't point it out to her because he didn't want to frighten her. Instead, he just grabbed her hand and together they ran away down the beach, away from the black cloud. He glanced back at one point and saw that this cloud was now moving back over the Gulf. And as they exited the beach, he looked down to wash the sand off of his feet, and looking back, the black cloud was now completely gone, which seemed odd for it to completely disappear so quickly. And this is when his wife Linda said, what's wrong? What was that black cloud? Now Jim hadn't realized at that point that she had seen it too. Turned out she didn't see the craft itself, but she did notice this weird black cloud. And he told her, I think it was a UFO. That is, I think, a really kind of spooky case. I can only imagine what it must be like to see this black cloud floating towards you and then starts lighting up, and inside this cloud is a UFO with an ET looking down at you. I wonder if there's deeper levels of contact here, because it's pretty unusual for a person to see a UFO that close up and a humanoid looking down at them. There's no indication that this gentleman, the primary witness, had further encounters. But again, he had his wife with him. So while she didn't see the UFO, she did see the cloud, and she could see that he was shook up a little bit. It's an interesting case. And now we move to another one. These are much more recent cases. Some of you out there have been asking me to cover more recent cases, so I've been looking into it. And they're a little bit harder to find. It sometimes takes people a long time to report their encounters. I think that's one of the reasons. There does also appear to be somewhat of a drop-off of what I would call, face-to-face encounters with humanoids or onboard experiences or direct contact. I think there might be a number of reasons for that. But at any rate, there certainly are modern recent cases. And this is one of them, which is super fascinating. I call this one the Skinny Gray. This occurred on June 6, 2018, outside of the small town of Siletz, Oregon. And while there really is only one witness who saw the ET itself, her family did witness some of the symptoms or signs surrounding this encounter, such as eerie silence and buzzing noises and things like this. So there is some corroboration for this sighting of a very close-up encounter with a humanoid. This multi-witness humanoid encounter comes from MUFON researcher Ron Wright, who actually heard about it the day it occurred. As it turns out, his wife's son's girlfriend's daughter was the witness. And they reported it about 11 days after it happened to the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC. The main witness is a 12-year-old anonymous girl. On the evening of June 6, 2018, she, along with her mom and her mom's boyfriend and her younger sister, had traveled about 5 miles outside of the small town of Siletz, Oregon. They had plans to find some wood to construct a homemade bow. It was about 7:30 p.m., again 5 miles southeast of Siletz, and they were driving along Ojala Road into the woods. They took a little gravel road off of Ojala, and then they stopped the car because Jay, the boyfriend, went to go collect some wood for a fire. And while sitting in the back seat of the car waiting, the young girl, the witness, heard this faint buzzing noise, which she first passed off as an insect. In fact, everyone in the car heard this buzzing noise. But she looked outside of the car and saw something she'll never forget. And as she says in her own words, "Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the most bizarre thing ever. It was about 100 to 120 feet away from my mom's car. What I saw was a human-looking creature that was about 4 to 5 feet tall with pale gray skin. Its skin was so thin, it was almost transparent, and it was so skinny. When I made eye contact with it, everything went silent. The birds stopped chirping, everything was silent. Then it ran away. I saw it for about 10 seconds. So yeah, this creature, this figure was about 100 feet away. She said she was close enough to see that it had large, dark brown eyes, an oval-shaped head, no visible ears, just a small bump for a nose, and it did not appear to be wearing any clothes that she could tell. But she said it was so skinny she could actually see its ribs. She immediately told her mom and Jay, who said that they would keep an eye out for it. And it was just a short time later that this creature returned. As the witness says, "Then I saw it again. I knew something was up there. And as I said previously, it ran away, but it looked like it came from behind the stump it was standing by. I said, "Hey, I saw it again. I think we should go up there and look around." So they did, as the witness says. We went up there and looked around. And then, while I was standing where I saw it the first time, I saw it again. It moved so quick when I saw it. And for moving so quick, it was incredibly quiet. I yelled for Jay. I saw it again. So we went over to where I saw it the third time. And when we were talking, it got really quiet. And our voices echoed a lot more than the other places in the woods. So they walked over to where this being had stood and found what looked like tufts of rabbit fur on this sort of stump. They said this rabbit fur stunk real badly. They searched for tracks but couldn't find anything. The soil was quite hard in the area, so that's not too surprising. But then they returned home. So the second time this witness saw this being, she said it was visible for about 12 seconds. And when the being left, the sounds returned to normal. All the birds started chirping loudly as they had before this encounter. And as Ron Wright, the researcher, says, I spoke with the primary witness, this 12-year-old girl. She was very sharp and sincere about what she saw that evening. I do not think this was a fabricated fantasy, as I could sense the fright and excitement in this young girl's voice, which led me to believe it did happen. So again, while the other witnesses didn't see the creature, they all did hear the weird buzzing noise, and they also noticed the strange silence and the echoing as well. So this is a multiple witness encounter, although only one witness saw the humanoid. What I like about this case is that she saw this gray 3 times right in a row. It was reported on the day of the encounter to a professional investigator. So that is quite unusual. Often researchers, when they finally hear about a case, days, weeks, months, or even years have gone by. So the recollection of the witness is very fresh in this case. She was able to describe what she saw in great detail. And I love it when a witness can make an actual sketch of what they saw. So that also makes this case worthy of study and super interesting. And now we move to the last case of the bunch. This one is super interesting just because it's so darn recent. This occurred on June 1st, 2023 in Mifflin, Ohio. And I call this case a staring contest with an ET. And what's so interesting is this is the sort of thing that does happen quite a bit. People report this, where their gazes will lock with an ET, and it goes on for an undetermined period of time. It's also an interesting case because there was another witness. It's a very unusual type of ET, if that's what it was. There was no actual UFO seen in this case, so that does raise questions about the origins of this humanoid. But he saw it close enough and long enough, the primary witness, that I think he saw something very unusual, and I think it's worthy of taking a closer look at. This brief but very recent case was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, NUFORC. It was about 4 to 4:30 a.m., again June 1st, 2023, as 2 garbage men were collecting trash along their route on the back roads between Mifflin and Lexington, Ohio. There's quite a lot of woods in this area, and as the witness says in his own words, it was a dark wooded area. I was collecting trash cans when a tall human-like figure with a long neck, a broad upper body, a slender waist, and long legs and long arms peeked at me. We had maybe a 15-second stare-off. We never broke eye contact. It hunched over, still looking at me. It was about 7 to 8 feet, hunched over. I started walking to it, and it took off running into the woods. I got back into the work truck, locked the door, and drove up to get a closer look. But it was gone too far in the woods. It had pale skin, black circular eyes, and moved like a human. It was aware that it was noticed by me. It could run very fast and didn't want to be noticed. So this was a very brief encounter. The witness estimates that the entire incident lasted only about 30 seconds. But he wasn't the only one who saw it. His coworker saw it too. And to his credit, 20 days after the incident, he reported his encounter to the National UFO Reporting Center. Definitely a very strange humanoid, and kudos to the witness for having the courage to report it to the National UFO Reporting Center. I wish everyone did. We'd have a much clearer picture of what's going on here, but enough have that I think we do have a pretty clear idea of what's going on. We are being visited, and we have been visited for a very long time, as these cases show, reaching all the way back to the 1920s, all the way up to the 2020s. This goes to show this is an ongoing thing, that humanity has been visited far longer than that, I think, but definitely at least that far back in terms of humanoids and people being regularly visited by them. And what's so fascinating about collections like these is it really speaks to the wide variety of humanoids people see, whether they're short little guys, grays, tall, lanky humanoids, human-looking ETs, short little humanoid-looking ETs, robotic beings. I mean, you name it, it's out there. So this is just an extraordinary, interesting, and enigmatic facet to UFO encounters. So many cases of landings, too. These objects, these craft, I think that's what they are landing on the ground and leaving traces. So people talk about this being an interdimensional or spiritual phenomenon. I don't think so. With people, getting implants, these objects leaving landing traces, being photographed, it's clear they're physical. So I think there still is a lot to learn about ET contact. It's one of the reasons I do this research. I know a lot of you out there have had encounters like these, and it's comforting to know that there are other people who've had these same experiences. So that's it for today. I really want to thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it. And like I always like to say at the end of each episode, keep searching for the truth. It's out there. Keep asking those hard questions because the answers will come. And most of all, keep having fun because that's why we're here. Love you all, and I will see you next time.